Greetings, this is Greg. This is part 3 of my P-47 Thunderbolt series. During World War II, the U.S. 8th Air Force operated in Europe. Within the 8th Air Force, the top 10 Thunderbolt aces survived the war. That's not true of the P-51 Mustang, nor is it true of the P-38 in the Pacific. The Thunderbolt was a tough airplane and was probably the most durable fighter of World War II. In this video, we will cover the plane's structure, armor, and other forms of pilot protection, as well as the plane's defensive systems. Durability is tough to quantify, but often pictures tell the story. This Thunderbolt landed with a 500-pound bomb still attached, and just after touchdown it exploded. There isn't much left of the plane, but the pilot survived and walked away. Now, I'm pretty sure what happened here is that the bomb fell and detonated just far enough behind that the plane's armored plate was angled towards the explosion, thus protecting the pilot, but still, surviving that is incredible. The fuselage is a strongly built structure in itself, but it has a few extras to help keep the pilot alive. Often when ditching, planes tend to flip over. The P-47 doesn't have any large air scoops under the fuselage or under the wings. The smooth surface helps when ditching on land or especially in the water. However, the designers of the 47 gave it an additional feature to help with this. It has a built-in crash skid. There are many pictures from World War II showing P-47s that ditched, and they tend to hold together really well. If the plane does flip over, the pilot will appreciate the P-47's next feature, which is essentially the equivalent of a race car's roll bar. It's located here at position 11A and provides what the manual refers to as turnover protection for the pilot. As far as I can tell, you lose this protection with the bubble canopy, but hey, you can't have everything, and the bubble has its own advantages. The wing structure is very strong. It has 2 main spars and 3 auxiliary spars. One of the auxiliary spars is extra strong as it's used to take stress from the wing-mounted landing gear. This multiple spar design seems to reduce the chance of a single bullet or cannon shell causing catastrophic damage to the wings. There are numerous cases of Thunderbolt wings surviving hits from 20mm, 30mm, and even 40mm cannons. I couldn't find a single case of wings coming off of a P-47, not as a result of speed, battle damage, or anything else. It probably happened at some point. World War II was vast, so it almost certainly did. But I've watched Luftwaffe gun camera footage, at least all of it that I could find, some of which we're going to go over in a later chapter. And I've read many after-action pilot reports, and none mention P-47 wing failure. The P-47 in this case flew through trees, and the wings stayed on. The plane made it back to base. That's pretty extreme. Let me remind you that this P-47 took damage from a 500-pound bomb. The wings are still on, shredded but still there. The P-47 in this picture hit a chimney. It lost part of its wing, but still made it home. There are many pictures of machine gun and cannon damage to the P-47. In this picture, the damage is so vast that the rear spar is visible, yet the plane made it back to base. As I said earlier, it's a bit tough to quantify durability. For example, if a P-47 did have its wings shot off, we probably would not have a picture of it. However, we do have a lot of pictures and gun camera footage showing P-47 wings being hit and not coming off, and we have after-action reports supporting that data. The vertical and horizontal stabilizers are made in much the same way as the wing, each having a smaller version of the 2 main spar design. Now it's time to talk about the plane's armor. The manual states that the armor is about 3/8 of an inch thick, or about 10 millimeters. Of course, what matters to the pilot at the receiving end of enemy fire is just what will this armor stop. The Thunderbolt manual makes this pretty clear. It's going to reliably stop US .30 caliber or equivalent fire, even at close range and at right angles to the plate. Of course, the German fighters often had 13mm machine guns, plus 20mm and sometimes 30mm cannons. Under some conditions, the armor might provide protection against those large calibers, but you certainly don't want to count on it. We'll discuss this a little more later. I'm not a ballistics expert, but a quick review of some U.S. Army data from the period shows that in order to stop an armor-piercing US 50 caliber round, you're going to need 3/4 or 19 millimeter armor plate. I found no official statement anywhere suggesting that the P-47 armor could stop 50 caliber or similar types of ammunition. Interestingly, the only US plane I found that did was the late model Corsair, specifically the F4U-4 variant. Up front, the 47 has bullet-resistant glass, and below that, an armor plate. At the front, the pilot is further protected by the engine and the forward fuel tank. At the rear, it has auxiliary armor, and this gets interesting. It has, well, I just said it has auxiliary armor plate. That's in addition to the armor plate, and I hate to say it, but I don't really know what that is. I even have a picture of it in the parts manual, which I'll put up. I still don't know what it is. In this picture, item 1 is the auxiliary armor, and item 2 is the rear armor. 5 is your front armor, 6 is the bullet-resistant glass. It says bulletproof here, but I beg to differ. Bullet-resistant is more accurate. So it looks to me like 1 and 2 point to the same single piece of armor. So maybe it's an extra plate behind the main armor that gives additional protection. The second piece cannot be lower than the main piece because the fuel tank's in the way. So I can't see any place it could be other than right behind the main armor. So my current thinking is that it's adding additional thickness, probably due to the threat of German 13 and 20 millimeter fire. But I'm really just guessing. Hopefully one of our viewers here has some insight on this and hopefully can post a source. That will be very helpful. I'll put up the list that goes with this picture so you can try to figure it out. Moving along, it's not all about the armor. Enemy fire from the front or rear has to travel through a lot of stuff just to reach the armor, and that adds a lot to the pilot's chances of survival. The P-47 has a lot of structure to slow down enemy fire before it reaches the armor. On the Chuck Hawkes website, there is an interview with a former P-47 pilot named Rip Collins, in which he makes the following statement comparing the Thunderbolt to the Mustang. Quote, "The P-47 was larger and much stronger in case of a crash landing. The Jug was built like a machine tool. Mustangs had a lot of sheet metal stamped out parts and were more lightweight in construction. One example was the throttle arm. You can see the difference. What does all this mean? The safety of the fighter pilot." Unquote. Having looked at various aircraft up close and having gone through various parts manuals, I think Mr. Collins' statements are entirely correct. Everything in the P-47 appears to be built to last, right down to the lesser hardware items like the aileron rod assembly shown here. Additionally, the 47's turbo supercharger system provides protection from fire originating from behind the plane. The turbocharger itself is heavily built and is actually shown in diagrams as an item that provides pilot protection. Furthermore, there's a lot of ducting back there, and this isn't like the ducting in your home heating and air conditioning system. Turbocharger ducting for the exhaust and charge air needs to be quite strong to resist the forces of internal air pressure. This is especially true of the intercooler end tanks. Pressures in this area can be as high as 40 pounds per square inch. Multiply that by all the square inches in the end tanks, circled in this picture, and it's many thousands of pounds of force trying to blow those apart. These are not simply sheet aluminum. They can't be that if they're going to resist the force. They're likely at least 1/8 of an inch thick, possibly more. Now, the intercooler and related ducting are not going to stop an 8 millimeter round. I'm not saying that. But they will slow it down a bit before it reaches the armor. In these pictures, the ducting shown in red and blue are under pressure and thus are fairly strong. The ducting in green is just sheet metal. That's not under any significant pressure and would have a negligible effect in terms of protection. The engine and self-sealing fuel tanks also provide protection for the pilot. We'll come back to the self-sealing fuel tanks. There's one particularly famous incident that showcases the P-47's durability. On June 26, 1943, future U.S. ace Robert S. Johnson's P-47 was hit by fire from an FW-190 and badly damaged. It was set on fire, had fuel and hydraulic leaks spraying into the cockpit, and its turbo supercharger was knocked out. Due to a jammed canopy, Johnson was unable to bail out. He regained control of the plane and headed for home. Thankfully for him, the fire went out, the plane was flyable. He was then intercepted by a single FW-190. Unable to effectively fight back in his heavily damaged Thunderbolt, Johnson basically had to sit there and endure a barrage of fire from the FW-190. Eventually, the German pilot ran out of ammunition, and Johnson made it back to base. After returning, Johnson assessed the damage to his plane and counted over 200 bullet holes in just one area before he stopped counting. In addition to these bullet holes, the plane was hit by 21 20mm cannon shells. 3 of those cannon shells hit the armor plate behind the cockpit. Why they didn't penetrate the armor, I'm not sure, but I can think of several good possibilities. The 20mm may have been some sort of non-armor piercing ammo that just wasn't right for the job. The shells may have been deflected or slowed down by other parts of the airplane structure, as we discussed earlier. Or the angle of the hits may have heavily advantaged the armor. This last thought is probably the most likely, as the damage behind the cockpit seems to support this. It's also possible that the plane had some additional armor plate beyond the single 3/8 inch plate. It could have been a combination of all of these, but in any case, at least in some cases, the Thunderbolt's armor would stop large caliber fire, and I can't help wonder if that has something to do with the auxiliary armor we discussed earlier. Now, 21 cannon hits, that's a lot. It was not unusual for a World War II fighter to be brought down by a single 20mm hit. I don't know of any other report of a fighter being able to absorb that much cannon fire and make it back to base. Johnson's plane, a P-47C as in Charlie, C-2, named Half Pint, was then scrapped and replaced by a D-5 named Lucky, which we discussed in episode 1 of this series. Back to the P-47, in addition to its structure, crash skid, rollover protection, and armor, like most U.S. fighters, it had self-sealing fuel tanks. All of the P-47s that operated in Europe had 2 internal fuel tanks, both of which are self-sealing. Self-sealing tanks utilize multiple layers of material sandwiched together. The middle layer is typically made from a type of rubber that swells when it comes in contact with gasoline, thus sealing the leak. This works incredibly well, and self-sealing tanks could resist 50 caliber machine gun fire, and in some cases even 20mm cannon hits. The downside to self-sealing tanks are increased weight and decreased fuel capacity. However, by the end of the war, nearly every combat airplane from every nation was equipped with them because the benefits far outweighed the downsides. In addition to all of this protection, most P-47 Novembers have 3 additional systems which are relevant to this discussion. The first is the IFF, or Identify Friend or Foe system. This would help increase the chance of friendly radar units recognizing the P-47 as a friendly aircraft. Even today, there's very little information out there on these systems, but I think the importance is self-evident. Next, the P-47 November was one of the few fighters with a true autopilot, not just a wing leveler. This frees up a certain amount of the pilot's mental energy and attention, which is usually spent on holding heading and altitude, and allows him to look around more, giving him a better chance of seeing the enemy first. Contrary to popular belief, most fighters were not shot down in twisting and turning dogfights, but were shot down by planes they never saw coming. This brings us to the 47 November's final defensive system, which I think is quite interesting. Let's have a scenario here. Let's assume that our pilot today is cruising at high speed and escorting B-29s in the Pacific. His autopilot is on and he's scanning the sky. Normally, his plane's speed and his attentiveness would protect him from being bounced by a Japanese fighter, but not today. Today, a Ki-84 Frank happens to be positioned in the sun and to the rear of the 47, and at full power in a descent, and it's gaining on our P-47. As the Japanese fighter closes into gun range, the Japanese pilot prepares to fire and blow the 47 out of the sky, and against almost any other fighter in this situation, he could. However, when the Frank gets within about 800 yards, still just outside of effective gun range, a loud bell sounds in the cockpit of the 47 and a bright light illuminates, warning our freedom-loving hero, who then takes evasive action. The 47 November's tail warning radar system alerted the U.S. pilot. Late in the war, electronics were getting smaller and smaller, and it was now possible to fit tail warning radar units into fighters, and many 47 Novembers were so equipped. As a side note, while tail warning radar was great in 1945, it was dead-end technology, as newer offensive systems made it obsolete by the 1950s. All this durability and technology was great if you were a P-47 pilot, but as with any airplane, there are weaknesses, and we need to look at them. The P-47's R-2800 engine certainly isn't a weakness. It had legendary durability. There are numerous tales of these things taking enemy fire that knocked out multiple cylinders and still making it home. But it is tough. It doesn't have a liquid cooling system, but as with almost any World War II aero engine, it does have an oil cooler, and in fact it has two of them. A hit to either of the oil coolers will eventually drain the entire engine oil system. It won't bring the airplane down immediately, but its time will be severely limited. I should stress that with the vulnerability of the oil coolers, that problem isn't specific to the P-47. It's an issue with just about every World War II airplane. The oil tank itself is also a vulnerability, but unless the damage is very low on the tank, it won't necessarily doom the airplane. In short, the engine itself is quite resistant to battle damage and has no liquid cooling system to shoot out. Damage to the oiling system can have a wide range of effects, from stopping the engine within a very short time to being an annoying leak requiring reduced power and a return to base. The Thunderbolt does have one vulnerability that's fairly unique to this airplane. Hits in the rear fuselage can destroy or degrade the capability of the turbo supercharging system. Significant leaks in either the pre-turbine exhaust ducting or the post-intercooler charge air ducting, or the turbo supercharger lubrication system, can reduce the maximum available manifold pressure, thus having a huge effect on the plane's high-altitude performance. This is actually what happened to Robert S. Johnson's plane in the incident discussed earlier. That's why he couldn't run from that FW-190. Worse, and I don't know of any other World War II fighter that has this issue, it's possible for the turbo supercharger to start an aft fuselage fire in the P-47. If this happens, the plane is lost, and the pilot must bail out. There's no way to extinguish such a fire in flight. Here's how it happens. If the fuel tanks take enough damage so they can't fully self-seal, fuel will leak out. At high pitch angles, the fuel can run back to the turbo supercharger, and at high boost, the turbine housing can reach temperatures high enough to ignite the fuel. This was rare, and I haven't found an actual case of it happening, so that's an important distinction here. But the threat is mentioned in official documentation. I don't think this is factored into the damage model of any current simulation, probably because it would be a very rare occurrence and unique to the P-47, but it would be cool if it was in there. As I said earlier, the subject of durability is somewhat tough to quantify. I think I've said that several times in this video. It's not like comparing climb speeds or top speed. So it's difficult to rank the Thunderbolt's durability compared with other fighters with absolute certainty, especially when you consider the more nebulous factors, like it's a lot larger than a 109, for example. So machine gun fire that would completely miss a 109 might still hit a 47 because it takes up so much more space in the sky. Still, I think that the evidence from photographs and pilot records are heavily in favor of the 47. It's very difficult to come up with apples-to-apples statistics for survival rates of World War II fighters because there are just so many variables. But in air-to-air fighting, the 47 was fighting the Luftwaffe in 1943 when it was still very formidable, essentially still at full strength. And after smashing the Luftwaffe, it was relegated to very dangerous ground attack missions. Now, I'll leave the detailed statistical analysis to other channels. There are others that are much better at that than I am. But from my own research, I've concluded that for any given mission flown by a fighter plane, your odds of surviving in a P-47 are significantly better than in any other World War II fighter. This picture shows 3 P-47 aces. In the middle is Hubert or Hub Zemke. His exploits in World War II are fascinating. In 1941, he went to the Soviet Union, and was there to train Russian pilots to fly the P-40. Later in the war, he battled the famous German ace Gunter Rahl, who ended the war with 275 kills. Rahl shot down 2 of Zemke's wingmen, but then the German ace was himself shot down in the battle, losing his thumb in the incident. Later, Zemke switched to the P-51. The wings came off of his Mustang, resulting in his capture, and he spent the rest of the war in a German prison camp. Zemke stayed in the military for 30 years, then worked in agriculture. He passed away in 1994. On the right is another P-47 ace, Walker Bud Mahurin. I'm not 100% sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's spelled M-A-H-U-R-I-N. He was the 6th highest scoring P-47 ace, and he is the only U.S. Army Air Force pilot to shoot down planes in Europe, the Pacific, and over Korea. So that's a pretty interesting statistic. He was shot down and taken prisoner in Korea. His story makes for fascinating reading, especially the portions about his battles with Russian pilots over Korea and his time as a prisoner of war and how he worked with the U.S. government to understand treatment of prisoners. It's a good read. Anyhow, he was returned to the U.S. after the Korean War. He passed away in 2010. On the left is Robert S. Johnson. He shot down 27 German aircraft, 28 by some statistics, which included an FW-190 piloted by a German ace with over 200 kills. After his 27th victory, Johnson was sent back to the United States. This was typical for U.S. aces. The prevailing logic among U.S. military leadership at the time, which was probably correct, was that at some point around 25 kills, an ace was of more value on the U.S. home front than on the front lines. A fighter pilot, especially an ace, was valuable on war bond tours, as well as helping to train new pilots and as consultants and test pilots working with or for other manufacturers. Johnson survived the war and became chief test pilot for Republic Aircraft. He co-authored a book with Martin Caidin called Thunderbolt. If you don't know who Martin Caidin is, well, Colonel Steve Austin would like to have a word with you. The book Thunderbolt is well worth reading. Robert Johnson passed away in 1998 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is where I live. I read his obituary, and sadly it was clear that whoever wrote it had no idea who he was. I'll close out with this picture. This is a painting in the Oklahoma State Senate, and it depicts his final battle over Europe. The plane depicted was a P-47 D-21, D as in Delta, which Johnson named Penrod and Sam. That name has dual meanings. Those were the middle names of his crew chief and of himself, and were also the names of 2 characters in a popular book, and the book was titled Penrod and Sam. I don't know much about that book, but it must have been very popular during the time the World War II generation was growing up, because it was made into a movie on 3 separate occasions between 1923 and 1937. I imagine it's something like it was seen with the sort of regularity that perhaps the current generation of fighter pilots had seen Harry Potter. I'm sure it's a completely different type of book, but I think you get my point there. So in the battle depicted, the 109 and P-47 fired at each other, I think in a head-on pass, I'm not sure about that. In any case, they both missed each other, and the 109 tried to run, but the P-47 was just too fast. The German pilot then tried to outmaneuver Johnson and was unsuccessful, and the P-47's 8 guns blew the wing off the 109. So that's all for this episode. We have 2 or 3 more to go in the P-47 series. I need to cover climb performance. I might work that in with the maneuverability episode, not sure about that yet. And also I have to have a video on the offensive systems. There's just so much of it that needs a video all on its own. So extra thanks to my Patreon supporters. They got early access to this video, and I really appreciate them. And thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already done that, and have a great day.